Hi, I'm Ben.
I'm Isabelle.
Welcome to Conversations in Company, a podcast from the charity Suicide&Co, here to make the suicide loss journey a little less lonely.
We've both been on the journey for a few years.
I lost my brother to suicide in 2018.
And I lost my cousin to suicide in 2017.
We really hope that we and our guests can offer you some companionship wherever you are on this journey.
Hi.
Hello, how are you?
Welcome back. Good, how are you?
Welcome back. Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm good. The sun's still shining.
It really is.
It's not too hot actually today. We recorded some episodes where it's been dripping with. That's a horrible. That's a horrible definition.
I think it's also
horrible way of describing it.
It's still the morning, so I feel like maybe by the afternoon it'll be like uncomfortable.
So anyway, it's good to have this chat while it's still comfortable and a nice temperature because you don't want to be sitting here sweating and then worrying about what you're saying on a podcast. But yeah, good to be back. I love these conversations. It's really nice to be able to just chat openly about stuff. I know we've been doing this for quite a long time now, but it's still so nice to just sort of sit here and reflect and talk about all the different aspects of grief. We must have done the first
episode like a year ago.
Yeah, it must have been about that. Yeah. What? Because I remember that as well. Not to keep talking about the weather,
that
like
was
some boring Brit. It was absolutely. It was so hot that first episode. I remember being in that tiny little studio, and it was just so hot. We've got a bit of a theme going with this podcast. We just sweat a lot.
points for Britishness.
Yeah.
Opening conversations about the weather. Ding 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 ding.
Talking about grief though, not very British. So breaking molds left, right, and centre with that. But we have to uphold some sort of tradition by talking about the weather at the start, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're talking about delayed grief today. That's what we want to talk about. And actually, we were talking earlier, and you have a story that I think would be really nice to start this episode off, to set the scene as to why we're talking about delayed grief and why that's important to talk about.
Yeah. So I used to work. I used to work in a startup. I've had lots of admin jobs to support my career. And when I say support, completely fund it is what I mean. And I used to work for a startup, and I was one of the oldest people in the London office, and bear in mind, I was one of the oldest and I was only 32. There were quite a few people who were not British and they were living in the UK. And one girl who I think was, she was Australian or New Zealand, like Kiwi. And so she was quite far from home and she was quite young. And at one point she said to me, I kind of knew, and I think you can often tell when someone's had like quite a major bereavement. I think I can often like sense that someone's like just a little bit like not, that they're a bit griefy. And she was having a bit of a rough time, and I think it was partly loneliness, and maybe it was like around the anniversary of her mum's death. And I think it had been like, she must have been like early teens or like maybe still like a proper child when it had happened. And she told her, I said, obviously like bring it up with your line manager. And so she told her line manager and was like, oh, it's around the anniversary of my mum's death and I'm just not feeling great at the moment. And her line manager was like 27, but like still very like eyes on the prize, like startup culture, like keep driving forward. Doesn't matter what's going on in your life, your head or whatever. And she was like, she died 10 years ago. But it was 10 years ago. Like, I'm not sure exactly what she said, but it was just like one of those things you're like, yeah.
Oh dear. What top 10 worst? Yeah, top 10 worst thing to say to someone. Aren't you over it by now? Surely.
Yeah.
Like 10 years. Like, oh god. As if there's some sort of like year that you get through where suddenly it's like, oh, that thing. I'm fine. I'm all good now. Yeah. That's so bad. And I think it really sums up why I think talking about this is really important, because we have this idea that grief is like, it comes in cycles. It does its little stages thing. It sort of and it's over, and then it sort of reaches a point where it's like, oh, it's over, it's fine, you're back to normal. It's nothing like that in reality. Not to
No.
sort of, I was going to say an awful analogy there. Not to I can't think now. Not to I was about to say
Just say the awful
piss on someone's
analogy.
bonfire, but that was not
Yeah.
this is not the podcast for that sort of language. But I'll say it anyway because I've said it now. Not to piss on someone's bonfire, but I don't even know if that's the actual analogy. My brain's gone. Not to piss
I
on
think
someone's
it's
bonfire.
shit on a bonfire.
That's even worse.
No, it's not. I'm joking.
Who's that worse for, the bonfire or you in that scenario? Anyway, not to whatever, watering can on someone's bonfire. To all the people that were telling me back in the day, like, these are the stages. This is what you're going to go through. These are the stages of grief. But at the end of that graph, it's sort of a flat line. It's just nothing like that at all. Like, I think the definition of grief that I was given was just so far from what it actually is. And I think actually, talking about the actuality of the experience of grief is so important, because I was just fed this just, I wouldn't say web of lies, because that sounds really malicious, but like this just complete untruth about grief.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also, like, because everyone's experience is so different, someone will be like, oh, you'll feel better after like this point, and then you're like, you get to that point, you're like, but why aren't I feeling better? Like,
yeah, you find yourself curled up in a ball 2 years later, just rocking back and forth, going, why am I not over it? Everyone told me I'd be okay. And it's true. That's exactly how you feel. Because if people tell you that this is how it's going to feel, and you don't then feel like it, your immediate reaction is, I'm doing something wrong, or I've done something wrong, or I haven't done this right, or I'm suddenly like broken or different. And that for me really was something I massively struggled with, because I didn't grieve like I was meant to grieve at all. And delayed grief for me was like a big part of what I went through. I didn't think for the first 3 months I really felt much emotion, to be honest.
No. Interesting.
It was like a numbness for me.
You said how you were meant to grieve. Like, how were you meant to?
I know.
Like, what's the form for that? Is there like a? I don't know if it ever, like, I think we might have talked about this before, but like, I was reading in a book about like the Victorians had like a handbook for how to deal with like things, and like a widow is allowed to grieve for 1 year and she wears black, and if you're like adjacent, you can wear purple. And I wonder if that's actually like a book that existed, and whether it would be really interesting to read that about why. Not because I don't think the Victorians dealt with emotions particularly well. I just think it's quite interesting that like there was an allowed amount of time for someone to be like, just like visibly like, do you know what? Like, I'm not the best person at the moment, you know?
Yeah. It still feels like that exists in a way though, because you get, if you're lucky enough to be employed, you get benefits like sick pay and a lot of companies now will give you a certain amount of time where you can take time off if you've experienced grief, right? Which is great, and that's a really lovely thing to be able to do to people. But it does still feel like it's the first 3 months or the first month. It's not sort of, oh, it happened 3 years ago and suddenly it's all come down on you like a ton of bricks. But let's come up with. It's like people have this very limited understanding of the timeline of grief, where we think that it's the first 3 months that you need time off, which of course you do, because then the first sort of initial aspect you've got so much to deal with.
It's also just at that point you're like just dealing with like, not even, I just don't even think it's grief at that point. It's just like hellfire. Like, at that stage, I think you're still in shock.
Yeah, and I think this is when it becomes specific to our conversation, which is around suicide loss, which is actually, when very often that's quite a sudden, unexpected death. So in the first period of time, you don't really have the emotional capacity to start the grieving process, because you're just you're dealing with coroners, you're dealing with inquests, you're dealing with funerals, you're dealing with all these certificates, you've got all these hoops you've got to jump through, family, supporting other people, dealing with the shock and denial of there's no room in that to grieve. And grieving is a very active process. Like, it's a very active thing. And if you don't have the energy to do it, your body just won't do it. Now that's what happened to me. Like, the shock of it just took all my energy away. I was left with no energy,
Also,
and I couldn't then grieve properly.
I don't know if you had this. Like we had journalists contacting us.
God.
But it was that I actually found that like really, really difficult. Like that first weekend, I think it was me and one of my cousins had just tried to get in touch with some people, like just be like, can you please don't contact Jen's mum or her brothers, like any questions regarding the funeral, like we'll put the information out. This is our email addresses, these are our phone numbers. And a couple of journalists had gone onto Facebook to look for information and had contacted us directly on phones, on email, in my Facebook DMs. And I like, the others dealt with it a bit better, but I was fucking furious.
Yeah, it was this really difficult one with a journalist because you feel like it's an abuse of privacy, really, isn't it? I remember. So
it's just
again,
also like, it's one thing. Like, I just felt like it was 2 days later. I was like, can you just leave me alone?
Yeah.
Like, what you it's like it felt like vultures, like going like, oh, can we just really sorry to hear about your loss. Have you got 5 minutes to speak about your cousin on the phone? No, I don't. Like, for who? Who's reading this?
We went to school in a little like town in Kent, which is lovely.
Yeah.
And there's a newsagent's in the high street, and every break usually we'd go and like go to the co-op and get a snack or a drink or whatever. And there was this one newspaper that just decided to run a front page story about what happened to us. And outside the newsagents on the high street where I went to school was a sign on the road with I can't remember what it said now, but it was something like boy 15 Cranbrook School dies, and it's a bold writing. I'm like, oh my God. And I remember this particular newspaper printed our home address on the front of their newspaper. I know.
No.
It was wild. It was so wild. So, you know, like, I just think there was so much just abuse of privacy in that moment. And I know it sounds a little bit hyper hypocritical because now I'm like, again, I was going to say an awful analogy there, but now I like do a lot with the press and I really try and get stuff into the press, which is fine. But those initial weeks, it's just not really what you need to be dealing with. But I know so many people do have to deal with this, right? Particularly with coroners and inquests and, you know, things getting involved, which can be really difficult.
But that's also like number one, a little bit further down the line, like, and number two, that's an absolute necessity to make sure that like the death certificate comes through, all of the next steps in actually like dealing with it, the admin of someone dying is like, fine, sure, I'll do it. And also generally the people who call you from the coroners and stuff, or like the police and things, will be much, much better equipped to speak to you with some kind of kindness. Whereas a journalist, not on your terms, sliding into your DMs or printing your address on the front page of a newspaper, I'm sorry, I'm like, you.
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it? It's
Are
so
you okay?
wild. Like... it's just funny when people, look, I don't have a problem with most journalists. I think most journalists are great. But well, most journalists are great. A lot of journalists are great. But there's a whole other conversation about sort of like media guidelines around suicide and suicide loss. But I just think it just shows a light on like the stuff that you might be dealing with at the start, and it starts to paint a picture of like, of course you're not necessarily going to be experiencing full-on grief at that point because you've got so much else to deal with. You know, from my point of view, those first few weeks at least were not about living, they were just surviving and just getting through the days. That's not grief in my books. That's just sort of the initial shock. And that's why when we talk about delayed grief, like a lot of the reason that people experience delayed grief months or sometimes even years after the loss is partly because they've actually had to deal with all that shock. But from my point of view, the number one reason that I experienced that delayed grief by a few months was I don't think we truly understand the loss until everything and everyone starts going back to normal. And that actually
Yeah.
is, I think, one of the hardest parts about losing someone, because you lose someone, you've got family round. I was getting emails from my teachers at school being like, "Don't worry about exams, Ben." And I was like, "This is great. This is great. This is really weird and different." And this sort of the
Yeah.
novelty keeps you afloat a little bit, and then everything goes back to normal, and you've got the normal, you know, boringness of life, and suddenly you just feel this pit of your stomach, like, oh God, they're gone, and I'm left in all of this, and that's when you start to see what's actually changed, and for me, that's when my grief started to happen, was when like I was back to normal and going, oh wow, that's really happened, and you can start to then
Mm.
cry and experience those emotions and going through some of the stages that they talk about in terms of grief.
Yeah, and I think there's also something about like in that initial of like busyness and like before the funeral and like waiting for the funeral to happen, and then the funeral itself and like the day after, like all of the like step by step and going like, okay, I've got a date to build up towards, and then after that, the following day even you're like, okay, I've done that bit, and like
Yeah.
we're over that first initial, and that can be any amount of time. Like I don't know how long it was before Sam's funeral, but I think we had a 3 week wait, but I think
Mm,
that's a sort of, I think that's a bit of a classic in January because lots of old people die, so they have lots of
right. Ours must have been
backlogs.
about the same actually. Yeah, 3-4
Yeah,
weeks. And well, we
and
were
I
also
think
January.
yeah, I think after that, I remember being like, okay, right, well, I've kind of almost put a little bit of a marker where it's now February, it's a different month, like it's like,
Yeah.
oh, like we can move on a bit. And I think I mean, I quite clearly remember like really, really feeling like I was having a breakdown at the beginning of April. And like, so I felt at the time, actually, I didn't even think that was a bit delayed, and it did feel a bit delayed, but like
Mm,
at the time I was like, oh, I'm still in the first year, so this is kind of like par for the course. Um,
yeah.
but then I've kind of, there's been sort of waves of it later, like obviously around the anniversary, but that's slightly different. But I had another massive, massive like drop. Oddly, for some reason, I'm not sure why, right in the middle of 2019. So 2.5 years later, just spent like 2, 3 days in like a real like,
Mm.
why did this happen? And like just being like almost having to like recompute the death again.
What do you think brought that on?
I think it was around possibly, and I think this might have been it, but it was around the same time. I think I was generally like feeling quite low generally. And but then also I think her friend, like there's a memorial group to her on Facebook, which I've had to mute because I find it a little bit like a bit weird. Like people, quite a few of her friends post in it like she's listening from that group, and that's
Mm.
fine. It's just not for me. I find it a little bit like it's just not my way. Um, but I'd still had probably the notifications on at that point, and I think someone expressed some suicidal ideation in that group, and like I felt quite panicked about it, and like I
Mm.
really felt like I needed to stop this guy from killing himself. And luckily, I think quite a few people in that group have had like some kind of mental health first aid training, or
Mm.
like, you know, and so a few people like commenting underneath, and it might have been around that time that this happened. But I have a really vivid memory of like one evening brushing my teeth at home and just being like, oh my god, Jen died. And it was like it hit me again like a car crash, like just like properly like, oh, this has happened. And I remember being like, oh no, like I don't want that to have happened. And then I remember being like, oh, but I'm writing a show about it. You're going to do
Mm.
something really good that's going to turn this into a positive, like not a positive experience, but you're doing something positive to to make your future look different, like address this in a better way. And then I was a bit like, oh, no, I don't want any of this. It was like a kind of like a visceral reaction, being like, I don't want to be in this position now. I'd like it to be back in like the innocent phase where she wasn't dead.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, and I don't.
How,
Yes, it's weird.
what was we talk about sort of delayed grief and that sort of experience, and I can imagine exactly why that sort of brought on difficult feelings. Dealing with something like that must be quite triggering. And I guess that's what it
Yeah,
is about, is it, as well. Like, you know, there's certain triggers that can bring on feelings that we haven't really accessed for quite a long time, which is what delayed grief is, really, isn't it? And something like that's
yeah,
certainly going to. And I've had similar experiences where something's happened or someone said something and it's just unexpectedly just sort of hit me, and I'm like, whoa, I need to take a moment here. What did it feel like? What, I mean, we talk about grief, but like, what was the sort of physical, emotional? What was the symptoms that you felt when it was like? Because very different symptoms, I imagine, to that initial phase of grief or that initial loss.
it's
You
really funny
mentioned
because I
panic.
didn't. Yeah, I did feel panicked, but also like just almost. I think because like that familiarity of like feelings, and so it when it hits you again, I just get a huge sense of heaviness.
Mm,
And I think when it hits you again and later, you're like, it's like, oh, have I got to go through this like wading through treacle again? And it's like, oh,
yeah.
I know how hard this is. And it was almost like an exhaustion of like, I don't, I don't, I don't even want to deal with this again. I just want this to be over.
Mm,
Um, I get quite bad like back problems, like just upper back tension. I think it's partly because I sleep badly, and then also like
yeah.
you know, I probably clench my teeth when I'm sleeping and things. All the really sexy stuff, and I. I think all of that really like doesn't help, because then not only are you like feeling quite heavy like
Yeah.
emotionally and physically, and you're not sleeping well, and then when you get up it's like my whole back and my neck are
Yeah.
like seized up and stiff, and then you're like, oh, I can't even I can't I like some of the things that I might do to make myself feel a bit better, like yoga or swimming, are then a little bit more difficult to do because I've got that tension in. So
Mm. That's
it's
really
just
interesting. It's really interesting you say that about like the tension in your back. It's just sparked a
yeah,
memory for me. So this was like 2 years ago. I went for a massage, um, and I was, you know, as you do, you sort of get chatting to the person that's doing it, and she was just like, I was like, oh, she must have been doing massaging for like, is that the word, masseusing, massaging? She'd been doing it for like
yeah,
10 years or something, and she started
hmm,
doing whatever they do to your shoulders, and she was just like, oh, have you like been to the gym? And I was like, no, not recently. And she was like, oh, you feel like you work out quite a lot. And I'm like, not really. I quite like running, but nothing to do with my arms or shoulders. And she was just like, um, when we were doing chatting after it was done, she was just like, I have to say, I've been doing this for 10 years and you have the most tense back I've ever felt. And I was like,
yeah.
oh, okay.
It's a
I'm
classic.
not sure what to do with this information, but it
Yeah,
was, and that for me was like, oh, I don't even feel stressed, but clearly just through that, like I haven't
yeah,
been exercising. I can understand where she was coming from in terms of like, if you're exercising, you're going to have tense muscles, but I don't do that.
yeah.
And she was like, you have the worst. I think she said that, I think she said worst back I've ever. And I was
Worst
like,
shoulder
that's a,
tension you've ever, yeah.
in 10 years. And I was like, oh,
Yeah,
okay. Is that, do I get a medal? Do I get
yeah,
something? But that's it, isn't it? It's like, everyone has this opinion of grief, that it's this thing you go through, that lasts a certain amount of time and that's over. But grief is something, and this is going to sound really dark. It's not meant to be sounding dark, and I'll explain in a second. But grief is something that never goes away. Like, you will live the rest of your life with a certain amount of grief.
yeah.
And Dr. Julie Smith, the psychologist on TikTok and Instagram, did an amazing video about grief. And she says, and it's quite difficult to explain without watching it, but basically she gets this piece of paper, this blank piece of paper, and if you draw a black circle in the middle, okay, that's your grief, right? And
Mm,
on its own, that's really powerful and really quite difficult to not see. But then as you sort of build life around it, you start getting more colours involved on that piece of paper, and you start putting bands around that grief of different colours, and eventually fill up the page. And actually, when you look at that page now in front of you, it's an incredibly colourful page. And there is still that little black spot in the middle, but
yeah.
actually you've just filled your life around it with things that are happy. And so it's not like the grief's gone away, it's there, but it's just surrounded by what your new life is about. And I think that for
Mm,
me is such a good way of looking at grief, is that, and this is partly why delayed grief happens, is that grief never goes away. we just surround it with other things, and not
Yeah.
bury it in a bad way, but we sort of hold it and embrace it and bury it inside us. And so it's no wonder that sometimes you go through a stressful life event, or something happens, or there's a change in your circumstances, that you're going to feel things like that, because deep down inside you it still exists and doesn't go away.
Yeah.
And I know we've spoken about this before, but I think it's really important that we understand what grief is. It's sort of that signature that someone leaves behind, and we don't get rid of it. It never goes away.
Mm.
We process the emotions behind it through grieving and crying and all of this stuff, but we still have it. We just sort of
I,
surround it with things.
I also think sometimes if you think of the word grief and like what that, like the imagery that that invokes, and I think like sometimes I think of like just lots of like really really free crying and tissues and like being
Mm.
really upset.
Yeah.
And to me, like there's been a couple of honestly moments like that, but a lot of grief has just been like just feelings of like just carrying on my life as normal. And like
Yeah.
honestly, I feel like I've just been holding myself together, like
Mm.
physically and emotionally all at once, like just getting through some of the worst days and just going like, right, you get up, I go to work, do my full
Mm.
day at work. I'm not a chatty person at work that day. I go home, I cook my food, I go to bed, like, and just going like, right, today I'm honestly in my little shell. And I think that's where that tension comes from as well, is because you trying to emotionally hold yourself together often manifests itself in like, okay, hold, pull in, gritted teeth, like, you know, eyes forward. And it then that's where that tension comes in. And I think not, and also particularly if you're dealing with something like repeatedly, so like you or I have both felt this a couple of months later, or like, you know, a year later, 2 years later, 4 years later, if you're continually doing that same thing and going through that same cycle, that tension will build up in your body and will build up in
Mm.
your soul as well.
Mm. I agree. I completely agree. Um, and for an example of some of the delayed grief I had, which was linked to sort of stress, because I think as soon as we're
Yeah.
stressed through something else, then we can start to
Yeah.
experience grief that's delayed. Right? Was university for me. Starting
Yeah.
uni, and fine, yeah. First year, it's novel. Yeah, I'm not going to say it was easy and brag it was easy. It was hard. It was hard to go from like this year that I'd had at school, which was a very unique experience of the last year of school for me, because I
Yeah.
was just surrounded by bubble wrap. Teachers were looking after me. Had every single person in my year group and in my school was sort of looking out for me and was smile at me when I was walking down the corridor. Just this almost like Truman Show weirdness that was going on for a whole year of
Yeah.
school, and then sort of just plunged into Liverpool University on my own. um, and it was like the bubble popped, and for me that was fine. Like it was sort of new and fun, and I met some great people there and had really lovely friends. But it got, when the work started to get harder towards third year, second and third year, and COVID happened, which was difficult. Then
Yeah.
suddenly, like I felt this overwhelming, and I've never really spoken about this overwhelming feeling of anxiety, and I felt so vulnerable. I just felt like I was this like wounded animal that was just trying to get into a corner to lick its wounds. I genuinely felt
Mm.
just this immense amount of anxiety, and I had to. This is one, you know, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but the reason that one of the reasons that I wanted to speak to a professional and go back to counselling was basically because of this feeling of anxiety and this vulnerableness that I felt. That's
Mm.
definitely not a word, but I'm going to make it one. This vulnerableness that I felt, and it would get so bad that like I was a student in a student block of flats, and sometimes I felt so vulnerable that I wouldn't want to leave my room and go downstairs, or go and be around other
Yeah.
people. And I just thought, this is so unlike me. This is so unlike me. And I started talking to a counsellor and sort of got some professional support. And it was only then through talking to her that she was just like, I really think that this is connected to your grief and what you went through. And we started going through some of the things
Really?
that people experience. And I was like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. And isn't it so funny? Because you're experiencing it. And I was going, don't be stupid, Ben. Why are you being so pathetic? This is ridiculous. Like, you're not like this.
Yeah.
Just get on with it. And then suddenly, it just takes one professional to be like, yeah, it's because this awful thing happened. Do you remember that? And it's
Yeah.
still having its effect on you, understandably so. And I'd never felt like that before. And it was just one of the ways that certain aspects of grief can just sort of rear its head. That for me was, and anger was a big one. Like, I just
Yeah.
get these sudden waves of anger, and I'd have no idea where it came from.
And I think, I mean, a shared thing, I found like I'd always been like this bubbly, like center of a conversation, like always around, like want to be around people. And so I think then it's for me, I found it was like an added pressure that like not only was I feeling quite lonely and like sad, but also as an extrovert who gets energy from other people, I didn't want to be around other people, and I also didn't want other people to have to experience this, what I was going through around me, because I just felt a bit tainted. And so then you're like in this really difficult position where you're like, I can't. How do I get myself out of this if I'm not? I'm just in my room, and
Yeah,
like
and
I mean,
it's a
added
vicious
with
cycle,
COVID
isn't
as
it?
well, like,
Oh
and I
God,
think
same.
yeah, well, and I think also, I mean, obviously I was a bit older, and I like, so I think I can't imagine having had to go through that and then be at university, which I think it's obviously like on paper it looks like this really fun time, but I
Yeah,
think for so many people it can be a really lonely
yeah,
experience, and like, particularly like even in halls, or if you're in a student flat, like I think you're still finding your feet of who you are and who your people are, and I think it's a really, really tough time to be going through a big bereavement.
Oh yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah,
It was tough, and it was. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that it's the reason I didn't manage to finish my course. Like,
yeah.
I know that was
Oh, I
capable enough
didn't know
to.
that.
Did you not know that I dropped out? Yeah,
No.
I got to third year. I had
Yeah,
started my dissertation, and I
yeah.
realised I was not going to pass, and so I just had this massive panic one night, and sort of, we're not allowed to. Shouldn't use the term breakdown now, but that's essentially that was it
Oh,
was. I just had
really?
this overwhelming feeling of emotions coming out. I know I heard that the other day, but understandably it's got like negative connotations, whatever. But anyway, I had
Yeah,
this
you should try
overwhelming feeling of
experiencing one.
emotions. Yeah, overwhelming feelings of emotions. Like, I remember I was so. Actually, if I'm thinking about it right now, it's so obvious that this was fueled by grief, because I had so
Yeah,
much suppressed emotion that I remember I was working on my dissertation with my dissertation partner, who was an ex RAF mechanic, knew his shit really well, and he asked me. I was doing aerospace engineering, so I was like designing and making planes. He asked me to calculate a tail volume coefficient, and I was like, "Yeah, sure, no worries." I couldn't find anything about this anywhere. I didn't know what it was, and it was this one little thing that I just pushed me over the edge, and I became so angry, and so emotional. I remember just desperately wanting to get out of that situation. I smashed my chair to pieces. Like, I had a little desk chair, and I just tore it apart, because I was just so much emotion built up in me. And anyway, I emailed my course supervisor, and I was like, "I'm really sorry. I want to suspend my studies." And then I text this guy back, and I was like, "Hi. So I've just left university. I'm really sorry." And he was fine. I've checked in with him. He managed to get first, and it was all good. It was all good. But yeah, no, I left, and there's no doubt in my mind that the reason I wasn't able to just engage my
yeah.
brain and make sense of anything during my course was because my brain was preoccupied with so much else. And at the
Mm.
time, I gave myself a lot of. I just really beat myself up about all of this, and now I look
And
back
that
and I'm
would have
like,
been
no wonder.
that have been like 2020?
Oh God. 2019 to 2023 is all sort of a bit of a blur, but yeah, probably
Yeah,
2020, or it was,
yeah,
I think it was around sort of December 2020 or January
yeah.
2021. around that
Yeah.
sort of
I
time.
mean, also really not great times. You know,
No,
if you're thinking
no,
about the best times in the space of humanity, I feel like
not good.
December 2020 and January 2021 are probably two of the worst months I've lived through.
Yeah, yeah. Tell me about it.
Um,
But, but you also,
y-
I guess, connected to all of this is the idea that grief should be separate from other stresses, and it's not. It's like
Hilarious.
part of everything. Isn't it true though that we think of grief as this like separate thing that's in its own corner, when actually like COVID probably brought up a huge number of different
Yeah.
emotions for people. Actually, I'll tell you what. The funny thing about COVID was, I Sam would have really enjoyed COVID, I think, and the lockdown aspect of it. He loved anything that was a bit novel, or a bit interesting, or like, oh, this is new. And I remember thinking when COVID was happening, I was like, oh, it's such a shame that Sam isn't here, because he would have really found all of this quite interesting, what was going on. But yeah, it's funny that we separate all grief from other experiences, because like it's one and the same. Like a stressful thing happens,
Mm.
you've got grief inside you. Of course, it's going to make you feel a little bit weird and difficult about stuff. It's going to heighten your sort of emotional response to things. Like,
I
and
think
when you're in
also
the moment,
like
it's very difficult to understand that. And when you can step out and go in, see in, you're like, oh yeah, of course that makes sense.
I think there's also like there's so much like different layers and colors and textures to grief that when something else is happening, it will always, I think, give you a little, when something else stressful or sad or emotional or, you know, a massive head fuck happens.
Mm,
I think some of those little, like any one of those emotions that you're feeling will give you a little like glimpse of what that
yeah,
grief was like. So it will be like this kind of muscle memory of going, oh, this, I know how this feels. And I
yeah,
think sometimes that has a risk to take you into a bit of a like a delayed grief phase. You know,
yeah,
so if it's a stress at work or it's, you know, a family stress or well, you're just a bit, you're just going through a depressive phase or you're feeling low or you're particularly anxious about something, that color or texture might give you a little glimpse of what that felt like 2, 3, 4 years ago, months ago, something, I don't know. And then that might take you into a bit of a delayed grief
yeah,
phase, you know?
yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I completely agree. And it's again, it
and
just goes back to this point where it's like this grief is an experience that you hold for the rest of your life. It's you know, when you've gone through it, you are, again, not to sound dramatic, but you're changed. You're a changed person. Like you've now got this experience, and you will carry the fact that you've gone through this experience with you for the rest of your life. And no, it's like when you look at it like that, no doubt you're going to change how you interact with certain experiences.
yeah,
Um, you're like the way we deal with things. I mean, your mental health, for example, the way you describe mental health is any forms of health that affect how you think, feel, and behave, right? So when you've gone through something that's difficult, like grief, that has an impact on your mental health. It has an impact on the way you think, feel, and behave. There's no there's no way that impact isn't going to have an impact on everyday things that
yeah,
you're dealing with. And when it comes to delayed grief, I just think we need to be a lot kinder on ourselves, understanding and being more compassionate to ourselves. That even if it's 10 years down the line, even if it's 30 years down the line,
yeah,
you've still had this experience, and no matter how much you've dealt with it, like you've still had that experience, you've still hold some of those emotions, and that's not a bad thing. Actually, I think it's a really incredible thing that we have as human beings, that we can really grieve someone so much. It's magical, really. But we should just
yeah,
be kinder to ourselves. If it's 30 years down the line and something happens, or someone says something, or you have an anniversary, and suddenly you just get this overwhelming feeling of loss, just because it happened 30 years ago does not change the fact that it happened to you. And I think it's worth just being a little bit kinder to ourselves when with what we're meant to do. I think we should ban the word should. I never come across, in my job, I've never come across a good use of the word should. And so anytime you catch yourself saying should, just give yourself a little slap on the wrist. Like, we shouldn't be,
yeah,
do not use the word should, because as soon as you use the word should, I should have done this, or this shouldn't be happening, then
Yeah.
we've got the wrong attitude towards it. I've never really, in my job, I never hear a good use of the word should.
Yeah, it's really funny because also like there's so much of that that's like I don't know whether it's maybe like that we are really really approaching grief differently these days, but like someone who's saying that to you, like who's saying you should have done this, or is that pressure that's coming from yourself as well? And I think there's so much that's about listening to yourself and about listening to your body and
Yeah.
listening to like each day and like checking in, like how do I feel today, what's going on. You know, it doesn't need to be like a full on like mindfulness like routine, but just really really like existing in yourself at a specific moment.
Yeah.
um because
And keeping
I think
track of them as well, keeping track of your
yeah
days. Like, I think this is the big takeaway that we probably talk about quite a lot, that everyone can do, is just like understanding when you're feeling vulnerable, understanding that it might be linked to grief, being a little bit kinder with yourself to be able to take days off and give yourself a little bit of a break. Understand that sometimes you're going to be more susceptible to stress, other times you're not, you're going to be able to deal with more stress. Understanding that your emotional, sort of ability to carry emotional loads and support and stress it fluctuates, it changes. And so I think we just need to be a little bit more mindful of that, and sort of build that self-care routine, that we have as a backup for if we're having a difficult day. And like you and if I have a bad day, I know that I'm not going to do my usual work. For me, that means
yeah
talking to people that are in some pretty bad situations. I'm not going to be able to do that, so I'll cancel those things. I'll try and get some exercise in. If I need to work, which, let's face it, I'm self-employed, I'll try and do admin
yeah
jobs or things that I've been putting off, right? Unlike you, actually, like admin for me is an escape from the sort of job stuff. So I know that I can do that. Then I'll try and get out for some air, get out for a walk. I'll try and do something nice, that makes myself feel better. But beyond that, I'll just be a little bit kinder to myself, and I'll go, oh yeah, this is just happening. That's fine. We're going to move some stuff around, have a chill day. And if I want to sit on the sofa and watch Netflix and just
yeah
sort of get a bag of popcorn, because that's what I need, and light a candle, that is what I'm going to do.
yeah
And I think I had a huge number of years where I would feel like you had to work and you had to push through stuff, and that's how you solved it. And actually, it's the
yeah
opposite is true. The only way you get through stuff like this successfully is by doing you just letting it happen, and not trying to distract yourself through it. And again, this could be the first month of grief. This could be 30 years later. It doesn't go away. We still have bad days, right? That's one of the
yeah
realities of life, is we'll have good days and bad days. I just think it's important to know how we react to ourselves having a bad day. And usually people
yeah
aren't very good at it.
And I think if you're in a situation like a work situation, like where and like I know some people's works have got like bereavement leave and like a mental health day and this that and the other. A lot of places just don't, and I think it's worth acknowledging that. Like for
Yeah.
me, I think personally, even if people are not talking about mental health days or bereavement leave, or you don't work for a progressive company where you can have a bit of a like slow week and you can explain to your line manager softly that like you're going through delayed grief, like this, just because your person died 5 years 2 months and 3 days ago and there's no significant date around now, it's just hit you in a wave. If your mental health is severely impacted by that on that specific day or in that specific week or in that specific month, that to me is an illness. Like that is no less bad than having referred pain from an operation you had in your left foot 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Like that's exactly the same. And I think you need to acknowledge to yourself, like even if you can't take a mental health day or like have a couple of days where you're not doing stressful things for your job and like addressing it with your line manager, however you decide to deal with that with your work or with your friends, like just acknowledge to yourself and just have enough security in your own the voice in your head saying this isn't an okay situation for me to be in. This is not my norm. I'm not well, and I'm just going to give myself an out. Like, I really struggle to cancel plans with friends once I've made them, and I'm really,
Same.
really having to learn to do that. Like, for mental health reasons. Like, I'm not at my best. Like, it's a real thing. But like, if that's how you're feeling on that day or in that month or in that week,
Yeah.
give yourself the space to heal.
Yeah.
Your
Talk to yourself.
your body and your mind will thank you for that later.
Yeah, I agree. We talk to yourself like you're talking to a friend of yours that you deeply care about. And I've done this. Yeah, I've had friends come up to me and they're like, "Oh, this is all going on, blah blah blah." And when we're having a conversation, they'll say something like, "I feel really bad taking time off work," and you're just like, "No,
Mm,
that's exactly what this
yeah,
has been designed for. Like you are literally the exact scenario that they
yeah,
designed sick leave for, right?
yeah,
Don't feel guilty about it. And sometimes I think we just need to talk to ourselves like we'd be talking to a friend that we care about. And we don't.
yeah,
We don't talk to ourselves like that. But sometimes we just got to be like, hold on, what would I say to a friend? And that's what you've got to start saying to you. Like, of course, if you need to take a day off because you need to go and
yeah.
marinate on a sofa and just watch some awful
Coco
TV and just have a
on
cry,
Disney Plus.
yeah, right. And just whatever it is, just if you need that,
Yeah,
you need that. And you know why? You know why they inevitably eventually signed off on sick leave at companies is because
mm,
actually, like, again, not no, people don't do this for the economy, but it boosts the economy. Your business will do better if you treat
yeah,
people better when they're having a bad day because staff turnover will reduce because people will like working there and not leave.
yeah,
But also your productivity goes up. And even if you're self-employed, taking a day off, even if it feels counterproductive, will be better for you in the long run because you'll be able to stay well and stay motivated and productive for longer. And it's just like, it's so
yeah,
counterintuitive to go, oh, we don't do mental health days here. Brr, we get
yeah.
crack the whip. Let's get to work. Blah blah blah. And it's just like, oh, that's such a backward way of thinking. We need to be kind to people, and if you're kind to people, you drive down staff
Yeah.
turnover. You increase loyalty, increase productivity, and it's just the way we should be treating human beings. So be kind to
But
yourself as
also,
well, and get
yeah,
the support you need.
just remember, like, there's lots of in a workplace. I think there's lots of like, I've worked in places in office jobs where there's a real desk culture and a real
Mm.
culture of like working through pain. I used to work with someone who I think she'd had an operation for endometriosis, and she got on a I think she took a long flight, like long haul UK to Asia flight, and she could have booked business and she booked economy just to save the company money. And she still flew 2 days later. And I was like, girl, you don't have to do this. Like,
Yeah.
nothing, nothing is worth your health. And she still did it. And I was just a bit like, and there's a lot of people around you. There will be a lot of people around you who are like, you're letting everyone else down, or like there will be a culture in an office. No one's going to say it directly of like, this is, you're supporting a team. And if you drop out, none of that matters. Just remember that I think you can do 3 days of self-certification of being ill, and then you need to go to your GP. And I know it's very difficult to go to speak to a GP at the moment. Like, trust me, like, I've tried.
Mm.
But like, if you really, really need to speak to a GP on a specific day about your mental health to get signed off for a week, and if you're really, really struggling, don't let the receptionist off the phone. You call them and say, I really need to speak to a GP today. I'm not very well. Like, if they say, well, what's it about? And you'd
Hmm.
be like, it's mental health stuff. Just leave it. Say as little as you need to and keep them
Hmm.
on the phone, and just make sure you get signed off if you need to, and stay off.
Mm.
I think personally, depends what your company offers. It depends on your financial situation. Stay off for as long as you can financially afford. If you're in a job, like, honestly, if you can afford three days on statutory sick pay, fine, take those 3 days. If you can afford a week, take a week. Like, just give yourself the space to recover and heal.
Yeah, and it's so true. I think it's something we gloss over so easily in society with
Mm,
ourselves. We never really give ourselves the credit or the space or the time or the respect or the kindness we deserve. and it sounds a bit like wishy-washy, but it's just so true. It's so true. If we spent a day just like reflecting on what we were saying to ourselves, it would be so damaging and unnecessary. It's just sort of the nature of what we've been told to how we've been told to sort of be. So yeah, I
Yeah.
completely am with you. And also, it's worth saying, like we're this podcast is from Suicide&Co. We have counselling sessions available, professional support
Yeah.
available. For me, the only reason that I realised what I was experiencing at university was to do with my delayed grief was because a very, very lovely, very friendly professional counsellor sat across from me on Zoom and told me that it was likely connected to it. And then that was like a light bulb going off my head when suddenly my very sort of engineer mindset of cause and reaction, what if I must be broken because this isn't working, right? Engineer mindset. It was like, I just needed someone to be like, no, it's not because you're broken, Ben. It's not because you're not good enough. It's because you went through this extraordinarily difficult thing 5 years ago, 4 years ago, whatever it was. And no wonder you're feeling like this now, because now you're back into a normal life, but you're carrying this baggage of stuff. And it was the first time anyone said that.
Yeah.
And I think that allowed me to then be kinder to myself and realize that I wasn't prioritizing my own health as much as I need to be. And it was just
Yeah.
so useful. And obviously we're coming out of this podcast is here because we want people to feel less alone, because we want to myth bust around some of these important topics, so someone doesn't go to work and is told 10 years is too long of a time since their person died to be experiencing grief. We want to myth bust, but also we want to just reduce that stigma around getting professional support. I think that actually talking about grief is really important. Whenever I know that there will be people who experience grief or symptoms of grief 10 years down the line and will feel like they're not worthy of speaking to a professional, because they'll go, oh, but it happened 10 years ago. Like, it's not really, I don't want to waste anyone's time talking about this. You are just
Yeah.
as I can't think of the word, just as able to access the support and worthy of the support as anyone else. I just think it's important to when the need arises, just deal with it, rather than start saying, oh, some people are just going for it, they're more important than me. That's just not true. Like, if you're dealing with symptoms like this, you're just as worthy of getting that support as someone else.
Yeah. And I think also, like, I've gone back to professional counselling basically whenever I've been able to afford it. So, like, sporadically, like for like 3 months, 4 months, I've been like, okay, I'm just going to go back and access, and just because I think I feel like it's been one of the best ways to support myself through everything now. And it always comes up. It doesn't, like, even if I'm dealing with like some other completely different feelings, and like I've since COVID, my career's changed quite a lot, and I've had quite a lot of anxiety about like different things that have been happening in that way, and like just lots of stuff, and things about reaching my late 30s, but there's never, I don't think there's ever a session where like there isn't a bit of a like, oh, but then when my cousin died, like it comes up so regularly. And it's funny because I think there's just something to do with just like living and existing after a suicide loss. And I think it's just, there's always a little bit of politics in your head surrounding that. Every little life moment that you hit, to me, and I think probably for you as well, like the little life moments, like, because it's a peer rather than a parent or anyone else, the little life moments that you hit, you're aware that that person's not going to experience those life moments, or not experiencing yours or their own of those moments, or all of those things. And I think that's one of the things that makes existing after a suicide loss, quite hard. All loss, but like specifically,
I'm completely with you, because actually, and again, this is where it becomes interesting, this conversation, is because actually sometimes it's the happy stuff that makes you feel
Yeah.
grief stronger. I haven't got married, but I can imagine having a wedding and sort of, you know, the empty seat can feel like
Yeah.
a big gap, and it can probably be quite emotional and sad. I know certainly that, you know, my girlfriend now, Sasha, and a lot of friends that I've made, you know, I would have loved for Sam to have met them.
Yeah.
And that, sometimes I do think about that, and I'm like, that fills me with quite a lot of sadness that
Yeah.
they're not going to be able to know him, and he's not
That's
going to know
making me
them.
well
And
up.
yeah, and just like, you know, I think as well, like he really wanted, he would have really loved to be around people that were so kind, and all these people that I now have in my life that are so kind and so like open and lovely, and I'm like, you would have just taken so much away from meeting these people.
Yeah.
And I think about that quite a lot, how actually, like, grief, you notice grief when happy things happen sometimes, um
Mm.
and that's when you sort of check yourself, and you're like, oh, I actually feel really sad thinking about that. And the important point of that is, we shouldn't just push away that sad feeling. Like, if something
Yeah.
let's say hypothetically, I'm at my wedding, right? Okay, hopefully, you know, whatever. I'm
Yeah.
at my wedding, and it's an incredibly happy day, but there's that feeling of sadness around Sam not being there. There is no reason
Yeah.
why no one's going to have a problem with you just saying, I just think I need to take a moment, and just going and being emotional and expressing that emotion and being sad, because actually an element of that is really sad he's not there. And I think
Yeah.
we as British people, particularly with this sort of stiff upper lip that we're born with, we do just sort of go, oh, but it's happy, or at least this is happening, and paint silver linings around all the clouds. And like, sometimes
Yeah.
sad things happen during happy things, and let's just not use the happy thing as an excuse not to feel the sad thing. The two can exist at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's happened to me before, where fun, exciting things have happened, and I've just been felt with this overwhelming sort of sadness. And it's just about giving
Yeah.
yourself permission to also be sad.
I think also, like, I mean, my brother got married 2 years ago, and one of our cousins got married in exactly a week later. Um, and I think at both of them, there was just in one of the toasts, there was just like a bit of an acknowledgement to like absent friends. So, and I think at my
Mm.
brother's, they named them. So like, you know, grandparents, and then like significant other
Yeah.
big family losses. And so at that point, it was my cousin, but also my auntie who died in between. And it was just, it like at that moment, it's like, it doesn't, for me, it didn't even taint the day. It wasn't even like oh, have you got to think about a sad thing? It was like almost just
Yeah.
bringing them into the room. And I felt like it does make, also because you're always at the toast, you're always like 2 glasses of wine down, just sitting there
Yeah.
being like, oh yeah, my cousin died.
Yeah.
But like,
Yeah.
it's fine. You can be a drunk crying bridesmaid at a
Yeah.
wedding. Like,
It's fine. Yeah, it's fine. It's so true, and I think this is it. We just got to acknowledge that grief doesn't go away. This is essentially what we're talking about in this episode. Is that
yeah,
just because you're experiencing it 30 years later doesn't make it any less difficult or intense as someone
yeah,
experiencing it immediately. And there's lots of reasons why it might come up as a delayed grief, but it doesn't make it any less important to deal with. So to move towards the end of the episode, then
yeah,
let's chat about what we can be doing. I mean, we've spoken a little bit about giving ourselves time, speaking to professionals, taking sick leave if we need it, even if a boss
yeah,
is saying 10 years is too long, just trying to find a way
yeah.
of getting ourselves that space. Is there anything else we can be doing more generally? Perhaps coming from the angle of someone else, or someone supporting someone that's dealing with grief. Is there anything they can do to maybe support someone that's dealing with delayed grief?
Um, I think if you're supporting someone dealing with delayed grief, or if, God, do you know what? If you know someone who's had a big loss in the last, you know, any number of years ago, I think if they're just a little bit quiet, or just seem a little bit not themselves, if something is out of the ordinary for their personality or pattern of your communication or engagement with them, I just think out of the blue, just being like, hey, like, no press, just checking in, seeing how you are. Not heard from you for a bit. I hope everything's
Yeah,
okay. Because like
yeah,
I I missed a lot of that. Like people I've had, and actually my friend said this. Her mum died, and a few of her friends were like, "Why is she being so quiet at the moment? Under 6 months later." But like, if someone's being quiet or like not in their normal communication phase, like not being normal in the way they communicate with you, I think you can just be like it's totally fine if you're just busy, but like I hope you're okay, because the chances are they might just be having a really shit week, and that's okay. They don't need to talk to you about it, and you don't need to expect them to talk about it with you. But just being like, hey, well, when you're coming out of that, like, let's go for a walk, let's go for a coffee.
Yeah.
Just seen this art exhibition. Do you want to go and do that? Oh no, you find art boring. What about it? You know, so anything. Just be like ready for them to come out of it. You know.
Yeah, I agree, and I guess as well connected to that is, try and put some of their important anniversary dates into your diary, so you're aware of what's going on. So this is sort of a do as I say, not as I do, because I want to do this more, but it's just the anniversary that someone died is unless you're connected to that death, it's probably not an anniversary date that you're going to particularly remember. So if you come across it, just pop it in your diary, and have it, and you can set a lot of diaries, just repeat it every year. So you'll just be aware. And I think it's worth checking in with someone around that date, or if you know their birthday, whack that in your diary just so you remember it. And you have that diary sitting in there, so you're like, oh, this is happening next week. I'll just send them a message. I know you've got this coming up. Imagine doing and the friend that does that for you every year. And I've got friends that do this, and it means the world every year to have this. The friends that do that every year for 5 years. Imagine 7 years later, someone's still being like, I know it's difficult. You've got a difficult day next week. Hope everything's all right. Let me know if you need anything. Right?
Yeah. On the day is like there's no rules about it. Sometimes I get the message on the day and I'm like, wow, this person's like, but even if it's like 2 weeks later and you go, and I've done this with one of my best friends, her mum died 2 years ago, and I've forgotten about it which day, but like 2 weeks later I'm like, oh babe, I'm so sorry, it's the anniversary of your mum's death this month and I missed it, but like just acknowledge it. Like you know, we're all. I've got reminders in my calendar for everything, and I'll still fucking forget. But like, just acknowledge it sometimes. You know.
I agree, and also what you do by doing that, but you know, carrying on with the theme of the episode, talking about delay. I'm not talking about a year later, but a considerable amount of time later. If we're still checking in, the message it sends to people that you're sending the message to is, you're acknowledging that they may still be feeling these things. So even if in themselves they're going, I should be past this by now, you're giving them permission to go, actually, yeah, you know what? It is still quite difficult around this time of year. And again, we're quite bad at self-reflection. So to sort of step in and give someone the permission to feel bad, it can be really powerful. And it only takes one person to give you that permission to suddenly feel sad. So worth checking in. And also on the flip side of that, talking about how we can cope, it's worth just sort of proactively thinking about ways you can cope with stressful things that are about to happen. Anniversary days, maybe you can organise some stuff to do if you know things are coming up. Maybe organise a nice walk with a friend that's been supportive. Being open about how you're feeling with people. I know it's been 3-4 years, but like, I just find it really difficult this time of year. Would you mind just going for a walk next week? It'd be really nice to catch up, and I really appreciate just talking through things with you. It really helps me. It can be a nice way of doing it. And obviously, you know, if you need support, you can go to your GP, you can go to Suicide&Co, you can get professional support who will help you and really help you understand what it is you're experiencing, and how you can get through it. So look, there's lots of things that we can be doing, and I think it's really important to talk about this, because people don't understand that grief's a long-term thing. People think it's a sort of flash in the pan, when actually it's a drawn out, long, sometimes quite nasty, but a beautiful experience. And I think that's how I've tried to frame it in my mind. It is absolutely astonishing that we can hold such level of emotion that 30-40 years later we can still feel intense emotion about someone that we've lost. I think that is just an astonishing experience to go through. And I have to say, I just think grief and the whole experience of grief is just this beautiful process. We don't ever think about that in ourselves as beautiful, though. We see it in elephants. Everyone loves elephants because they grieve, right? You see it on David Attenborough. They're like, the mother elephant is grieving the child. And we're like, oh, isn't that incredible that an animal can do that? I'm like, well, we do that. It is absolutely astonishing that we can hold so much emotion to someone. Like, I just think we need to be more, I mean, we've said it all, haven't we? More kind to ourselves, respect ourselves, and just put the framework in to look after yourself when you're having a bad day, whether it's a day later or 30 years later. There we go.
Cool. Yeah.
That's Delayed Grief.
We've done it. Thanks so much for listening. Conversations and Company would like to thank Acast, our wonderful guests, and all of you listeners. Thank you for your generous support. Please rate, review, and subscribe, or send a link to someone who might need it. Remember, you can go to our website to check out the various support services available through Suicide&Co. We'll be back with another episode soon.